So we could sort of recap what is meant by the social construction of race. What does it mean when the argument is being made that race is a social construction? Well, it should be readily apparent to you that the meaning of this is that people, human beings, create race rather than race existing naturally or in nature. In fact, it has a history. It's not universal. It's not the same conceptions or concepts that stood in ancient Greece all the way to Ming Dynasty China, all the way through today. Okay, it has constantly changed. That's unlike other entities like H2O. It's always the same, regardless of historical period. And indeed, these take for granted ideas of race, they change over time, which is what we mean by race having a history. And is invented or created in social interaction, and therefore becomes part of our social structures. And sometimes it's foregrounded, sometimes it's not. As we mentioned before, the modern period, let's say during the medieval period, let alone the times of antiquity, race, or let's say skin color differentiation, of course, people were aware of this, but they did not foreground it. Rather, it was religion that was foregrounded. And still more evidence that race is social construction. Well, you could look at each country in the world and notice that, they have their own way of classifying people based on race. They have their own understandings of race. By the way, same with gender. Some countries like India, they automatically assume it's legally recognized that there are three genders rather than two. In the Western world, it tends to gravitate towards two genders. But similarly, you can see that with race. It depends on where you are. Often it's culturally specific. So just to summarize, there's nothing essential or biological that applies to all members within a given racial class. You're going to see differentiation more so than similarity. Similarity may be, this skin color, right? There's going to be light skin and darker skin within one. However, in other words, there's still going to be a spectrum within there. And you could probably notice more differentiation within that class of people more so than similarity. Now, some people argue that, hey, at the genetic level, isn't there some genetic affinity with all persons within that group? And the answer is no. According to biologists, there's no single gene shared by every member within a racial group. Okay, so all these put together, and I'm sure we could add more when we think about it, it helps reinforce, it lends support to the argument that race is a social construction, something that we created. Now, before I go on to discuss these specific examples of how the law socially constructs race, what I want to do is address this question. Why even invent race, and why foreground it? Actually, the philologists who look at the term race, they notice that this word was first used to refer to your so-called blood family, or even your kinship. It was not linked to skin color. And it was within this, if you will, very small locality, right, where they used the term race. In other words, there was no large-scale interaction with different people, just within, let's say, the confines of a medieval village, perhaps. They used a race as synonymous with blood, so to speak, right, as in family blood, or a clan, or a kinship again. And then the same term is employed as Europeans encountered foreign people when they begin to colonize other areas of the world. So this term morphed during that endeavor. And you can imagine the encounter with foreign people and just foreignness in general. It shook the sense of what was quote unquote normal at this time, let's say in the 16th century. So the notion of race that was originally based on kinship and family was, or changed to a type of kinship based on skin color. And that was opposed to the darker skinned people that they colonized. So a simple reason to invent race is just utility, meaning usefulness. Race is useful, or was useful, in creating this dividing line between different kinds of population. You base it on physical appearances, and the most obvious difference to you as you go out in the world is skin color. But still another reason, perhaps more fateful here and more seismic in its consequences, is that the social creation of race intersects with power. And that's, as I just suggested, is more malignant than just mere utility or usefulness. That is, by defining the racial other, what you're doing is subordinating and control. Quote unquote, to define is to control. So think, for example, of terms like savages or uncivilized. Think of Rudyard Kipling's term, half devil, half child. So historically, European colonizers used their white skin as a feature to claim their superiority by contrasting themselves to those with darker skin, because that's the kind of people who exist outside of Europe. They used that to contrast themselves and ultimately to consider themselves as inherently superior, while the other races of the world were inherently inferior or savage, according to this metaphysics of race, so to speak. And still, to go further, what happens is what was created becomes normalized, becomes naturalized in the minds of Europeans. By the way, this is a term called reification, reification. This is a term nowadays that philosophers use when people make something that is abstract or conceptual, when they make it real, or they misbelieve that it is in fact real, okay, and concrete, when in fact it's just a concept. Now, just to remind you, of course, academics and scientists are not claiming that there's no such thing as dark skin or white skin. Of course, that's true. What is, however, being questioned is the tendency to universalize starting with skin color. Okay, like I said, it may have been used originally as a useful way, right? Utility, a useful way to differentiate. From there, it took a life on its own, as we know. And it comes to a point where you have examples such as in this slide before you. For example, in our country, what we see historically is that persons of African descent became solely attached to the condition of enslavement. Okay, not other races. What it was is this arbitrary decision, and it's spurred largely by economics, to be frank. This arbitrary decision, someone made a decision to say, from now on, persons of African descent, they're slaves in our country. And again, we have to remind ourselves that this notion of racialized slavery, as I just described, did not exist in the ancient world, did not exist in the medieval world. It's really only emerged during the modern era. Now, what does the law have to do with this? Because the argument being made is that this is a form of the legal construction, right? The law. Well, what we notice is in colonial Virginia, what happens during the 17th century, as the tobacco plantation owners began to need more labor, and they found out that the English and Irish laborers were insufficient. They were not a tractable labor force. They could not depend on them, really because their tenure as a servant was limited to only 4 or 5 years or 6 years. So they wanted a permanent labor force, and thus the decision was made to turn towards the African slave trade. And here's the laws they passed in Virginia. They passed two primary laws, though there was a few others, but the two primary laws are this. The first one you could call, quote unquote, perpetual slavery. And what this means is a slave is going to remain a slave from birth to death. Now, the slaves in Virginia before that, they were not necessarily enslaved their entire lifetime. Okay, like I said, indentured servants, it was only 4, 6, 8 years perhaps. But now they're saying you are a slave from cradle to grave. And the second law that was passed is this. From now on, all persons born from an African woman will also be a slave. Okay, in Latin, this law is called partus sequitur ventrem, and it's translated as status follows from the womb. And they're basically saying, all persons of African descent will be fated to be slaves. So look at that. You now inherit slavery. Okay, and there's two laws that were put in place, as I just discussed, that led it to so. Okay, still another one is something we already discussed, the law of hypodescent, and that's when your racial status legally is determined by the lower race. If you are biracial or mixed race, they look at the parents, and whoever's the quote unquote lower race on the racial hierarchy, you legally assume the racial status of that parent. Okay. And of course, one example of that is the one drop rule, where even if you have one drop, so to speak, and by the way, that reminds us, they used to use this notion of blood, right, as attached to race, when in fact, there's no such thing as racial blood. We already discussed that. Okay, still another one is the law passed, if you recall, during the 1882 Exclusion Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, that is, and they included this provision that basically stipulated that persons of Chinese descent, and it would go on to apply to other Asians, are ineligible for citizenship. So you see this law claiming that, I know it says aliens and that's generic, but it was applied towards Asians in particular. Okay, it's a generic categorization, the term aliens, but the spirit of the law, so to speak, is applied towards persons of Asian descent. So look at that. Automatically, it is determined that persons of Asian descent could never be naturalized to become a citizen. And this makes them perpetual foreigners within the country. And again, we have to remind ourselves, what was the rationale undergirding that? Well, it was Orientalism, the firm belief that persons of Asian descent or Orientals could never assimilate to Western society. Okay, so these are some laws in our past, and indeed, you could think of other laws, even more current laws, where you see, the law affecting some kind of change or perhaps even creation of new legal categories. Even when you think about science itself, science came up with their own classification, like Caucasian versus Negro versus Mongolian, right? As we discussed. Well, that's going to influence lawmakers. So when they go on to determine anti-miscegenation laws, they'll be thinking about those scientific classifications, and they will be inserting that within the statutes, right? So you see this interplay of science and common sense even, and of course the law, right? All involved in this complex interplay again to socially construct race.